Ghost of Tsushima is an excellent game, oozing with style and riveting combat, carried by a mostly great story, which, unfortunately, is nearly derailed by the flawed mission structure as well as the complete lack of any meaningful choice or consequence, although the game was explicitly marketed with light RPG elements. Additionally, it claims to be historically immersive, and for the most part it is, but it is also guilty of several glaring anachronisms and omissions which not only damage the plot, but also the integrity of the characters. At this point, the game has been out for several years, so I won't bother recapping the entire plot, only my problems with it. Suffice to say, you play as the samurai, Jin Sakai, following the defeat at Komodo Beach, a real historical event during the first Mongol invasion of Japan. The main personal conflict is your character's struggle to stay consistent with his Bushido code, while also using unorthodox tactics to defeat his enemies by any means necessary. In the skill tree and in the marketing, it is presented as if there is a genuine choice between playing as a samurai or as a ninja. There is potential for this to be a great system, with samurai skills rewarding more direct and yet more challenging combat, while using more indirect methods allows you to take out larger groups of enemies. Unfortunately, the storyline, a generally linear experience, forces the player to exclusively choose the path of becoming the mythical ghost. This is no deal breaker by any means. The game is called The Ghost of Tsushima after all. However, the fact that there seems to be a choice presented only for it to be made meaningless is somewhat frustrating. I believe that this could be a major improvement in any hypothetical sequel, perhaps with the possibility of some light RPG mechanics not only affecting the storyline, but also the structure of certain missions themselves. Speaking of, the linear, Rockstar-like structure of the campaign is the main contributor to what is ultimately my biggest problem with it. The lack of choice or variation in these missions lead to consequences which the player may feel as if being thrust upon them, rather than earned through any choice of their own. For instance, at the end of Act 1, Jin attempts to rescue his uncle, the feudal lord of the island, who has been taken captive by Mongols. The reason Lord Shimura is kept alive is because the Mongols want to recruit him to their side. Which, fair enough. This was certainly a tactic that would be right at home in any Mongolian playbook. However, this benevolent villain subversion certainly overstays its welcome. Lord Shimura refuses the offer, and yet he's still kept alive? In fact, the Khan sweetens the deal by offering to make Shimura the Shogun of Japan, which makes absolutely no fucking sense. Firstly, in any realistic scenario, Shimura, or anyone else brave enough to refuse the Khan's offer, would have been immediately executed, in order to demonstrate the cost of refusal. Secondly, when the Khan mentions that Shimura already has designs on increasing his power on the mainland, it seems to imply that the shogunate is weak enough that any daimyo, even one from a territory as insignificant as Tsushima, could seize power, which would of course imply that Japan is currently going through its infamous Sengoku Jidai period. However, this game takes place in 1274, almost 200 years before the start of that period. Of course, Shimura is really being kept alive so that Jin will be able to rescue him, which is ultimately, I think, healthy for the story. I found the chemistry between the two to be fairly compelling, and for me, it ultimately became the emotional core of the story. All of this dissonance could have been avoided, however, had we not been shown Shimura's captivity at all. The tension of not knowing whether he was alive or dead could have been compelling during the first act of the story, and it could have left the door open for virtually any explanation for his survival. Perhaps the player could have saved him just as he was set to be executed, or perhaps Jin would not even be aware of the Khan's offer at this point in the story, so it would take him more by surprise when he was made that same offer himself. The entire subplot destroys the pacing and logical immersion of the world, and it completely emasculates the villain. The reason why I'm making such a big deal out of this story element is because there is a great potential to demonstrate the differences between the rigidity of medieval Japanese society and the meritocratic incentives of the Mongol invaders during the story arc. One of the overlooked reasons why the Mongol Empire had such great successes in places like China, Iran, or Russia was because the meritocratic recruitment of warriors presented an excellent opportunity to advance in class in what were otherwise quite ossified societies. Offers of defection would have been customary to captured nobles. However, the true danger in this strategy would have been in the chance of converting talented defectors from the lower classes of society. Ghost of Tsushima almost stumbles upon this complexity in the stories of Ryuzo and Tomoe, both allies turned enemies by the lure of advancement in Mongol society. However, In both instances, it is made quite clear that theirs was a wrong decision, and that they would eventually become samurai had they only resisted temptation, making these otherwise compelling anti-heroes into cartoonish villains at times. Their dicey motivations could have been circumvented if Jin wasn't trying to hand out lordships like candy, and a more effective story arc could have commented on Jin's naivete stemming from his position as heir to the lordship of the island. Ultimately, his confrontation with his former allies might have left him and the player walking away with the realization that they might just have a point. And in his persona as the Ghost, doing anything to drive the Mongols away, he might not be so dissimilar from the shifty Ronin after all. The early second act is, I believe, the highlight of the game. There are some good character moments between Jin and his uncle, as well as a healthy dose of world building which adds a real sense of history and character to the island. The penultimate mission of this act attempts to tug on the heartstrings by showcasing the death of Jin's surrogate mother and the execution of one of his key allies. I remember being affected by this during my first playthrough, but returning to the game, they somewhat fell flat, as I now know that they were only introduced to justify the baffling story turns at the end of the act. The final mission of Act 2 starts out great, but stagnates when the Mongols use explosives to stall the offensive. Just as a side note, I think this moment would have been much more effective had it been the place where gunpowder was first introduced into gameplay. But by this point, the player has already been interacting with gunpowder technology and troops for several hours, robbing them of their difficulty and interest, and causing the subsequent actions which Jin takes in order to break the siege seem totally unnecessary. After a messy falling out with Lord Shimura, in which Jin acts like a complete brat, whereas up until this point he's been portrayed as a fairly level-headed character, he decides to use a local remedy to poison the entire Mongol army, which is apparently the only way in which he could avert disaster. Which, seems like they were doing pretty good during the siege already. It sort of hinted at that Shimura is planning to use the peasant army of Yarikawa as fodder for the assault. Maybe if this point was emphasized more, it would become understandable that Jin's compassion was driving his reckless action. Anyway, Jin poisons the Mongols' milk and runs into Ryuzo after the deed is done. Ryuzo engages cowardly, and Jin ain't having none of that shit. The second duel with Ryuzo was kind of redundant. If he was gonna be killed off, he could have been hours ago. He begs for his life, and Jin just decides to kill him anyway, which is another frustrating choice taken out of the player's control. The choice to kill Ryuzo could have been an excellent capstone to a samurai playthrough. After all, this event showcases Jin at his most bullheaded, choosing to chase vengeance for vengeance sake. Meanwhile, the choice to spare him could have been a signifier that a more reformed Jin was choosing to change his ways, showing that the Ghost would burn no bridges if it ultimately meant driving out the Mongol threat. As the mission wraps up, it becomes clear that the only true motivation for Jin using poison was as a blatant vehicle to move the story along. Most likely, the ending for the story had already been worked out, and this whole second act turn was merely engineered as a way to create a falling out between Jin and his uncle. Apparently, for the egregious crime of winning the war for the Japanese, Jin is set to be imprisoned and executed. This doesn't really work narratively, as the consequences for using poison haven't been established. And again, the choice is ultimately out of the player's hands. At this point, let's return to my objections to the Shimura subplot from earlier. Hear me out here. What if we reveal at this point, or at least imply, that Shimura actually accepted the Khan's offer, or was thinking about it, in order to keep himself alive? Remember, he thought that Jin was dead, so realistically he must have been asking himself questions about what would happen to his clan once he himself was gone, and whether or not it was better to die a martyr, or live on in order to maintain his family's legacy. Of course, that would all get thrown out the window once Jin rescued him, and he realized that there was still a shot at retaking the island. Until the second act climax, Jin was being kept in the dark. However, the Shogun would know, or at least suspect, that Shimura was being kept alive for a reason. So let's say that when samurai reinforcements arrived, they would announce that he was being removed as Jito of the island, and that anyone else who cooperated with Mongols at any point would be executed. Behaving as an entitled samurai, Jin would be disappointed that his birthright was being taken away. Or, if he has embraced the Ghost, he would recognize that the new samurai overlords present a threat to the people of the island, many of whom had little other choice than to provide the Mongols with food or shelter, providing Jin with the motivations for a major rift with the Japanese. Following the Battle of Castle Shimura, Jin would be imprisoned, along with his uncle, Then he would escape, beginning Act 4. Let's talk about Act 3. This might just be because of my immense disappointment with the Act 2 climax, but I believe that this is easily the weakest part of the game. The player is prevented from returning to the southern parts of the island until one of the penultimate missions, and is instead locked into the snowy region, which is much more sterile and uninteresting than the rest of the game. Don't get me wrong, there is some beauty to be found in this area, but it pales to what we've already seen before. To give the final fight against the Great Khan any sense of threat, and introduce consequence to Jin's actions, a bizarre subplot is introduced in which the Khan channels his inner Saddam Hussein and decides to use Jin's poison techniques on the islanders, as well as planning to use it against the mainlanders. Again, this doesn't really work. The choice to use poison was never given to the player, so there's no reason that they should feel any guilt for it being used against them. And as far as the possibility that there can be any remaining threat to the Mongol invasion, well, by this point, Jin has already liberated much of the island, so that doesn't really track. Jin gathers his forces for a final fight, which is really less interesting than the previous one, and has one final confrontation with the Great Khan, in which the only narrative tension comes from the Khan practically begging Jin to join the Mongol Empire, and Jin predictably refusing. Now let's return to my rewrite suggestions. I would keep things much the same, with Jin escaping imprisonment and fleeing to the northern stretch of the island. The difference here being that Jin would not only be fighting Mongol rebels, but also incoming shogunate forces. Fighting the samurai could be a really cool late-game challenge, and I think would provide better elite enemy types than the same old Mongols, only with more armor. Instead of coming across villages torched and poisoned by the retreating Mongols, Jin would instead come across villagers massacred by the very same people sent to liberate them. In fact, let's ditch the poison subplot entirely. The entire thing was done much better in the DLC and in the multiplayer mode, which links the poison to a more supernatural side of it. If there were more elements like this in the main campaign, and if it had been introduced earlier, I think it might have worked, but at this point in the story, I think it would be better if it was left out entirely. Overall, I wouldn't make too many other changes to the ending of the game. The only thing I would change is that, by killing the Khan, Jin isn't so much saving Japan as he is hunting down a defeated enemy. As he dies, he would be sure to remind Jin that, with or without him, the Mongol Empire will return. The true climax of the game comes when Jin confronts Lord Shimura, and damn, this ending hits hard. It almost makes the mid-game shenanigans worth it. Almost. Anyway, all this talk might have given the impression that I don't like this game as much as I say I do, but that's not true. For me, this is one of those games which is just short of being a masterpiece. If you're anything like me, those are the games that are really worth talking about. Nonetheless, things seem to go just fine for this game, and all signs point to good things on the horizon. My money's on a sequel coming out within the next few years, and if it's anything like the last game, I'll be one of the first ones to pick it up.